Hello, my silent heroes. There are moments in American politics that don't feel like news. They feel like history being written in real time. Not because of the policies debated or the speeches delivered, but because of what is finally exposed under the bright, searing light of accountability. And there she was, Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, the so-called guardian of justice, the woman who spent years parading herself as the moral compass of the Empire State, now sitting in a congressional hearing room, flanked by cameras and surrounded by a sea of cold, unblinking eyes. Letitia James wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She was the prosecuted. And across from her sat the woman who had come not to debate, but to dismantle. Pam Bondi, a name that, for some in the Democratic establishment, sends a chill colder than an October breeze in Albany. Polished, composed, with a voice that could cut through granite, Bondi sat like a prosecutor waiting to unseal an indictment, not just against one woman, but against an entire political apparatus that has long mistaken power for virtue. The hearing chamber was tense, suffocating even. This wasn't a routine oversight committee meeting. This was a political execution dressed in the formal attire of congressional decorum. Journalists scribbled with trembling fingers, pundits whispered furiously into hot mics off camera, and every political operator in the building knew what this was. A reckoning. Letitia James wore her usual brand of defiance, chin high, jaw set, clad in the performative confidence that has made her a darling of the liberal media. She wasn't here to cooperate, she was here to perform. After all, it was performance that got her this far. Fiery press conferences, empty virtue signals, and headline-chasing lawsuits that were always more about optics than outcomes. She built her career by weaponizing her office against political adversaries, launching partisan investigations that curiously aligned with the news cycle and the priorities of DNC donors. Wall Street scandals? Silent? Political allies skimming millions? Not a peep. But if you were a Republican, God help you. Letitia James wasn't the law. She was the political enforcer of a democratic machine that treats New York like a personal kingdom, where prosecutors prosecute only those who threaten the throne. And now irony had finally come to collect. Pam Bondi didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Her very presence was a rebuke, her silence louder than a filibuster. She simply stared across the table, eyes locked on James, as if weighing whether this moment called for a scalpel or an axe. Letitia, for all her bravado, knew the stakes. Her fingers tapped nervously beneath the table, a tell that no amount of political coaching could suppress. And Pam just smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. The smile of someone who had come prepared, not just with documents, but with truth. And that's what terrified them most, because the truth, in its rawest, unfiltered form, is lethal in the halls of power. The truth does not negotiate. The truth does not bend to spin. The truth doesn't care how many MSNBC appearances you've had or how many editorials the New York Times has published in your defense. The truth is merciless. And today it had a name, Pam Bondi. Letitia James had spent years weaponizing language, talking about equity, justice, representation, and all the other buzzwords the Democratic Party repackages to cover for systemic corruption and institutional rot. But behind every statement, behind every press release soaked in self-righteous moralism, was the stench of power abused. Because while she was suing former presidents for clout, her own office was funneling taxpayer funds into organizations that bore her signature and served her political interests. While she was ranting about protecting democracy, she was silencing whistleblowers who dared to question why state grants kept landing in the hands of her campaign bundlers. While she was prosecuting others for financial misconduct, She was allegedly siphoning public funds through layers of nonprofit fronts controlled by her allies. The Democratic Party didn't flinch. Of course not. They applauded her. They elevated her. Because in their eyes, she wasn't corrupt. She was effective. A useful, blunt object. A smiling face they could place in front of cameras while the machinery of grift spun beneath her feet. Letitia James became the symbol of a new kind of corruption, the sanitized, televised kind that hides behind representation and diversity while looting the public under the guise of progressive virtue. She wasn't fighting for justice. She was fighting to expand a kingdom built on fear, favoritism, and the politics of personal destruction. But kingdoms fall, and sometimes all it takes is one good hammer. Pam Bondi leaned forward, her voice slow and deliberate, a tone honed from years of dismantling egos in courtrooms and on national television. Attorney General James, thank you for being here. I imagine this must feel like unfamiliar territory, answering questions instead of asking them. But let me assure you, what's unfamiliar for you is standard procedure for the rest of us who believe in actual accountability. The room went quiet, not the respectful silence of political formality, but the kind that settles right before a thunderclap. Pam continued, "You've held yourself above the law for far too long. You've turned the justice system into a personal weapon, and today, that weapon is being turned around. Not out of spite, but out of necessity." The Democrats in the chamber shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at their phones, pretending to be busy. Others whispered among themselves, looking for the right talking point to spin this disaster into some sort of martyrdom for James. But it was too late. The tide had already turned. Pam Bondi had a dossier in front of her, thicker than a Bible and just as damning. It wasn't filled with partisan speculation or cable news sound bites. It was filled with receipts, documents, audio recordings, testimony from former employees, forensic audits, and enough emails to choke a hard drive. Letitia James may have walked into this hearing with a press team, but Pam Bondi walked in with the truth. And the truth had no interest in playing politics today. What made it worse for the Democrats, what made it unbearable, was that this wasn't a Republican witch hunt. No, this was karma, the long overdue balancing of scales they thought they owned. For years, they had used people like Letitia James to simulate justice, to create the illusion that they were holding the powerful accountable, all while protecting their own inner circle from scrutiny. They had turned justice into a branding strategy. And Letitia? She was the face of that brand. But even the best marketing campaigns fail when the product turns out to be poison. And so, the stage was set. On one side, a woman who had spent her career wielding the law like a cudgel against her enemies. On the other, a woman who came prepared to wield the law like a mirror, to reflect back everything the system had tried to hide. The hearing hadn't even truly begun, and already the smoke of political theater was giving way to the fire of real accountability. Pam Bondi didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Every word she spoke was precise, controlled, and sharp enough to leave scars. Because this wasn't just a takedown of Letitia James. This was an indictment of the party that created her, protected her, and pretended she was untouchable. And if the Democrats weren't sweating yet, they would be soon. Because the next words out of Pam Bondi's mouth weren't a question. They were a warning. This chamber is not here to protect your reputation, Madam Attorney General. It is here to investigate your conduct. And I assure you, when we're done here, you won't be remembered as a crusader for justice. You'll be remembered for what you really are, a political arsonist who mistook power for immunity. Power is a funny thing. When held for too long, it stops feeling like a responsibility and starts feeling like a right. And when people like Letitia James hold it, unchecked and unchallenged, it mutates from justice into vengeance, from accountability into a blunt instrument of ideology. But today, for the first time, That power was being peeled away like rusted armor. And the one doing the peeling was Pam Bondi. Letitia James had walked into the chamber like a woman above reproach, dressed not just in political defiance, but in the smug entitlement that comes from years of Democratic protectionism. Her reputation, once insulated by glowing headlines and softball interviews, was finally being subjected to something rare in her world: scrutiny. And scrutiny, real scrutiny, is something the Democratic Party hasn't had to face for a long time. Not while they've controlled the media, the narrative, and the institutions tasked with holding them accountable. Pam Bondi was about to change that. She opened the dossier. The room shifted. It wasn't visible at first, just the subtle rustle of paper, the turning of heads, the tight, controlled inhale of congressional aides who suddenly realized they were sitting in a room where history might be written with a scalpel instead of a headline. Pam looked up, her voice calm, slicing through the silence like a whisper with teeth. Let's begin with the Community Justice Restoration Fund, a nonprofit that, according to your office, was created to combat systemic inequality and provide equitable legal access to underserved communities. Letitia blinked slowly, hiding behind the mask of bureaucratic indifference. Pam continued, her voice steady and sharp. Would you care to explain why this fund received over $12.7 million in redirected civil penalty settlements? Funds that were supposed to be reinvested into victim support services, yet somehow ended up in the hands of an organization chaired by your former campaign finance manager? A pause. Letitia opened her mouth, not to answer, but to perform. She adjusted her mic, leaned in, and delivered the kind of rehearsed indignation that cable news pundits eat up like candy. With all due respect, Congresswoman, the CJRF was an initiative guided by our commitment to justice reform. Its board was vetted by my office, and its operations fall under state transparency laws. Pam didn't blink. And yet, those same operations show zero records of audited outcomes, no victim restitution logs, and internal communications, which I now have, indicating clear coordination between your staff and the board on dispersing funds based on political alignment, not need. The chamber stirred. That wasn't just an accusation. That was a loaded weapon. Pam tapped the screen beside her. A document flickered to life, an internal email, time-stamped, with the subject line, Funding Priorities for 2022 Midterm Climate. Letitia's name sat neatly in the double C line. Pam read aloud slowly. We should prioritize funds toward areas with demographic growth favorable to our long-term policy objectives. Letitia already signed off. She gets it. Silence. This wasn't incompetence. This was intentional. This was influence peddling wrapped in racial equity language. This was the democratic model: launder corruption through the language of compassion. Letitia's smile faltered, just slightly, a hairline crack in the mask. Pam saw it. The room saw it. Attorney General James, Bondi said, is that how you understand justice? That taxpayer funds should be distributed according to their political return on investment? Letitia scoffed, but there was no confidence in it. This is a gross mischaracterization. Pam cut her off. What's gross is using the pain of underserved communities as camouflage for what appears to be strategic voter cultivation. What's gross is pretending to care about victims while redirecting funds meant for them into political slush accounts disguised as nonprofits. You could hear a pin drop. Pam let the moment breathe, not out of theater, but because the gravity of what she just said needed room to land. And when it did, it landed like a brick through glass. The Democratic members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the narrative they'd prepared for. They were used to fending off conspiracy theories and far-right attacks. But this was cold, hard paper. Signatures, memos, bank trails, evidence. Pam leaned forward. You see, Madam Attorney General, your office didn't just fail to protect New Yorkers, it allegedly used their money to engineer future elections. You weren't fighting inequality, you were investing in a political return, and you did it behind a wall of media complicity that dared not question your motives. Letitia snapped back, voice raised now. This is a politically motivated interrogation. Pam didn't flinch. That's rich coming from the woman who launched lawsuits against a former president during an election cycle, gave exclusive interviews to partisan networks before indictments were unsealed, and held press conferences coordinated with DNC media handlers. Letitia's hands curled slightly on the table. Her nostrils flared. Gone was the cool prosecutor. What sat before the chamber now was a politician cornered by her own tactics. Pam could feel the shift. The audience wasn't just listening now. They were watching Letitia James crack under the very standards she imposed on others. And Pam wasn't done. She tapped again. The screen changed. Another email, this time from Letitia's deputy counsel. Subject line, green light on Empire Network funding. Body text, she wants it approved by Friday. Tell them to keep it quiet. Optics aren't great right now. Use community justice as the middle channel again. If compliance asks, we'll say it was part of COVID outreach. Pam turned to Letitia, voice lower, colder. So tell me, General James, since when did pandemic response include bankrolling media platforms that parrot your administration's talking points during an election cycle? Letitia looked toward her legal counsel, visibly flustered. Pam's gaze hardened. You're not under indictment yet, but don't look at your lawyer like that. Not yet. Not today. Today you're going to speak to the people you've been pretending to serve while using their money to build a political fortress. This wasn't just about Letitia James anymore. It was about the blue state empire she helped build. A fortress of fake justice wrapped in progressive packaging, where power is never questioned as long as it dresses itself in the right slogans. Pam continued, driving the blade deeper. You've turned your office into a political consultancy. You've blurred the line between law enforcement and electoral engineering. And the Democratic Party? She gestured to the silent line of blue-leaning legislators. They cheered you on. They needed a hit woman, and they found you. Letitia tried to interrupt, but Pam raised a hand, cool and commanding. Save it. We'll get to the cross-examination. But understand this. The era of Democratic immunity is over. The rules you ignored, they're coming back, and this time, they apply to you. For a moment there was nothing. No protest, no smug retort. Just the slow, creeping realization in Letitia's eyes that the armor she thought she wore was now paper-thin under the weight of actual accountability. And this was just the first strike. There's a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when someone in power realizes they're no longer in control. It's not when the accusations start. It's not even when the evidence is presented. It's when the performance fails. When the applause doesn't come, when the smug smile slips just for a second, when the shield of power, once ironclad, begins to rust in real time. And in that moment, the audience, the country, sees them for what they really are, naked emperors, cloaked in rhetoric, cornered by truth. Letitia James had built her empire on fear and spectacle, fear of being her next target, spectacle that masqueraded as justice. She had become the New York Democrats' prize sword, unsheathed whenever the party needed a villain punished or a narrative redirected. And for years, the media cheered as she played the role flawlessly. But now, the curtain had ripped wide open. The lights were no longer flattering. The stage was not hers to command. Pam Bondi had seized it. And now in this next act of political exorcism, she would drag the empire into the light. Pam tapped her screen again. The projection behind her changed. This time, not an email, not a memo, a video. Letitia's expression changed the instant the screen flickered to life. Her lips pressed together, nostrils flared. Not in outrage, but recognition. She knew what was coming. She had seen it before. So had her staff. The audio played. Letitia, at a closed-door donor roundtable during the last midterm cycle. These lawsuits aren't about convictions. They're about positioning. When the headlines hit, we dominate the narrative. By the time the courts catch up, the story's already told. A breath. Then she added, laughing, "We don't need a guilty verdict. We need a viral moment." Silence. Letitia James had just admitted, on tape, what critics had alleged for years, that she was never a prosecutor. She was a political arsonist. Her investigations were not about the law. They were marketing campaigns for her next office. They were weapons disguised as lawsuits, carefully timed, emotionally packaged, media-synchronized missiles aimed not at justice, but at political capital. Pam didn't gloat. She didn't have to. The evidence did the talking. She leaned forward, voice steady as steel. "So let me ask you, Madam Attorney General, how many of your public lawsuits were filed for the purpose of narrative control? How many were coordinated with your campaign calendar? How many were designed not for courtrooms, but for the front page of the New York Times?" Letitia sat frozen. Her usual defenses, the scripted rebuttals, the indignation, the deflection, were nowhere to be found. Because there was no spin left for this. No editor could fix that clip. No tweet could dilute it. Pam didn't wait for an answer. Because if even one prosecution was filed with intent to influence the public under false pretenses, that is a violation of prosecutorial ethics. If multiple were filed with coordination from political donors, that becomes a pattern of systemic abuse. And if your office received DNC-approved talking points in advance of indictments, well, she let that hang, then calmly delivered the kill line. Then you weren't serving justice. You were laundering it. The weight of that sentence hit like a hammer, and yet Pam wasn't done. She reached down and flipped to another section of her dossier. "Let's talk about suppression." The word itself shifted the air. Suddenly, a different kind of tension filled the room. Darker, more dangerous. "Over the past 18 months, your office has issued multiple gag directives to internal whistleblowers. One of them, a former deputy auditor, testified under oath that they were pressured to delete correspondence regarding misallocated funds to a media shell company called Civic Voice NY. Letitia's jaw tensed. Pam kept going. Civic Voice NY was on paper a nonprofit journalism incubator, but its board consisted of 3 DNC-aligned strategists, one of whom was on your transition team. And according to financial records we've subpoenaed, your office funneled over $2.1 million into this organization using COVID emergency communications funds. The screen changed again, now showing a flowchart of transactions. It was clinical, cold, impossible to deny. "So let's do the math. You took pandemic relief dollars, repackaged them as emergency community messaging funds, funneled them into a political media front, and then used that platform to amplify your legal battles while discrediting opposing voices." Letitia tried to speak. Pam didn't let her. "Do not insult this chamber with another denial. We have your sign-off. We have the wire transfers. And we have the internal Slack messages, courtesy of a whistleblower you tried to silence with a non-disclosure agreement disguised as a post-employment severance plan." Letitia's mouth hung open for a fraction of a second, not in surprise but in fury, because the machine was failing. The empire was collapsing. What Pam had just exposed wasn't just political sleaze. It was a system, a deliberate engineered infrastructure designed to preserve democratic dominance under the guise of social justice. They used nonprofits like laundering operations. They weaponized crises. They hijacked movements for political insurance. And through it all, Letitia James stood at the center. not as a leader, but as the gatekeeper of politicized lawfare. Pam exhales slowly, her voice dropping just enough to slice through the quiet. You've perverted the law. You've made the people believe you stood for them, while using their money to build an echo chamber of lies. And now that the light is here, you hide behind outrage and race and equity, not because you believe in them, but because you believe they will shield you from scrutiny. She paused. Let it settle. But the shield has cracked. There was no applause, no cheers, just the silent weight of reality. Letitia James was not a martyr. She was not a reformer. She was a cautionary tale, the inevitable result of unchecked power, cloaked in identity, and fueled by a party that confused representation with righteousness. Pam stood. The room stiffened. This chamber will now enter a recess before proceeding to phase 2 of this hearing. I suggest you use that time wisely, General James, because what comes next isn't just questions, it's referrals. Letitia didn't move. She couldn't. Her empire had been built on illusion, but the truth had arrived like a wrecking ball. Slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. And Pam Bondi? She wasn't done. Not yet. This was only... There comes a point in every downfall when denial becomes obsolete, not because the accused has run out of excuses, but because the receipts have arrived. And in that cold, clinical moment, when the evidence is undeniable and the narrative breaks, power begins to rot in plain sight. That was the moment Letitia James found herself in now. She had survived scandals before. Media softballs, friendly op-eds, and partisan coverage had served as her insulation. Every misstep was reframed. Every accusation became a smear. Every critic was branded a partisan enemy. And for years it worked, because the Democratic Party doesn't punish corruption. It promotes it as long as it comes in the right color, with the right slogans, and attacks the right people. But in this room, with Pam Bondi standing at the helm, no slogan could save her now. This wasn't CNN. This wasn't MSNBC. This wasn't a panel of sycophants echoing talking points between Starbucks sips and performative outrage. This was a tribunal of facts, and the judge was the truth. Pam returned from recess like a woman sharpening the final blade. She didn't need to yell. Her voice came low and cutting, like a whisper made of steel. We're no longer dealing with theoreticals, Madam Attorney General. We're past speculation. What we're about to walk through are line items, transactions, signed statements, and audit trails. This isn't a press conference. This is a post-mortem. Letitia sat stiff, composed but stripped of the smugness that once defined her. The room had changed, and so had she. This was no longer about saving face. It was about survival. Pam tapped her screen. The projection changed. A forensic financial map. A flowchart of movement between public funds, shell nonprofits, consulting firms, and campaign-linked accounts. The room collectively leaned forward. Pam walked them through it like a prosecutor with blood in the water. This diagram begins with state grant number 842-D, allocated in January 2021 for COVID legal relief. According to state budget logs, this grant was approved by your office and authorized for expedited community law services. She tapped again. Except the receiving entity, Community Legal Forward, was registered just 11 days earlier. No operational history, no staff, no service records. But it had one thing: a founder, your former policy director, working under a separate LLC in parallel to your campaign. Pam's eyes didn't leave Letitia's. The grant was transferred in 3 tranches: $750,000, $1.2 million, and $1.05 million, each within hours of campaign fundraising deadlines. None of the services outlined in the grant proposal were ever fulfilled. There are no records, no case files, no filings, nothing. A murmur swept through the room. Pam turned to the committee. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're seeing here isn't just mismanagement. It's not sloppiness. It's not bureaucratic fog. This is a systematic redirection of public money through political pipelines disguised as nonprofit channels. She clicked again. A list of names appeared. These are the individuals listed on Community Legal Forward's board. 3 of them are current DNC consultants. One is a vendor used by Letitia James's campaign for media training. Another is her cousin. Letitia remained silent, her eyes locked on the table, as if staring into the reflection of her own implosion. Pam pressed forward. Now let's talk about suppression. The screen changed again. An email, unredacted, from Letitia's internal staff communications. Subject line, "We need this cleaned up." The message was short. Media's asking questions about CLF. Delete anything that links us. If anyone leaks, fire fast and quietly. Pam read it slowly, then looked at Letitia. Was this your definition of leadership, Madam Attorney General? Is this how the woman tasked with upholding the law chooses to operate when the cameras are off? Letitia opened her mouth to object, but no words came, because this wasn't innuendo. This wasn't political theater. This was data, digital footprints, irrefutable. Pam delivered the final blow. On March 17th, 2022, your office sent a cease and desist letter to an independent auditor who had requested records on the CLF grants. According to the auditor's affidavit, he was threatened with legal consequences for misusing state data, even though he was acting within full compliance of New York's transparency laws. The chamber began to boil, not with noise, but with fury, controlled, simmering. The kind of anger that comes when those trusted with power betray that trust not with incompetence, but with calculated manipulation. Pam's tone didn't change. This is no longer a matter of ethics. This is a legal failure, a moral failure, and a betrayal of public trust. She turned to the panel. I move that this committee formally refer these findings to the Department of Justice for investigation into fraud, misuse of state funds, obstruction of oversight, and violations of campaign finance law. Letitia finally snapped. This is a hit job. Pam didn't blink. No, Madam Attorney General, this is what the end of impunity looks like. A beat of silence. Pam stepped back from the microphone, her presence still towering over the room. She had done what few dared. She'd forced a Democratic power player to answer for her actions, not in sound bites, not in symbolism, but in substance. And Letitia? She had no substance left to hide behind. Because what the Democrats never understood, or perhaps never cared to acknowledge, is that when the receipts come due, virtue signaling doesn't pay the bill. Equity doesn't clear corruption. Diversity doesn't erase fraud. And Letitia James, once heralded as the face of progressive justice, now sat under the weight of her own deception. Not because the right attacked her, but because the truth finally caught up. Pam Bondi turned one final time, addressing the room, but really the country. They told you she was a reformer. They sold you a lie. But the truth doesn't need to be sold. It just needs to be shown. The room erupted, not in applause, but in reckoning. This wasn't the end of Letitia James. This was the beginning of her trial in the court of truth. Some downfalls happen in silence. Others implode in fire, in front of cameras in the halls of institutions once thought impenetrable. Letitia James' collapse was the latter. The moment the gavel came down, the moment the referral to the Department of Justice was finalized, it was as if the scaffolding holding up the myth of her integrity disintegrated in real time. No more smirks, no more speeches, no more carefully curated sound bites broadcast through legacy media. All that remained was a woman once cloaked in the full power of a political machine, now stripped to the bone by the one thing that machine could never fully control: the truth. The hearing room was chaos. Flashes from 100 cameras lit the room like a crime scene. The press, hungry for blood after years of cover-ups and complicity, had finally smelled something they couldn't ignore. Their queen of performative justice had fallen, and even they couldn't rewrite the script fast enough to save her. Pam Bondi didn't look triumphant. She looked resolved, the quiet, steady confidence of someone who had pulled the fire alarm in a building everyone else pretended wasn't burning. Letitia sat stone still, her lips tight, her fingers white-knuckled around the table's edge. Her staff looked like statues, eyes vacant, mouths shut, PR playbooks closed, because there was no strategy left, no damage control, no spin cycle strong enough to wash out the stench of exposed corruption. For the first time in her career, Letitia James wasn't the storm. She was the wreckage. Pam adjusted the microphone. The chamber hushed. Her voice came out low, deliberate, calm, and yet devastating. Letitia James did not act alone. She is not an isolated mistake. She is the product of a culture that has infected our political system like a parasite, one that dresses corruption in cause, masks greed with activism, and protects criminality under the cloak of social justice. Every Democrat in the room flinched, because this wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about them. For too long, the Democratic establishment has treated accountability as optional. They've turned institutions into tools of personal vengeance, prosecutors into political operatives, agencies into echo chambers, and they've gotten away with it because they learned a trick. Wrap a lie in the language of compassion, and the media will not only ignore it, they'll amplify it. Pam's eyes scanned the room. But Letitia James was the end of that illusion. She tapped the screen one last time. A final image appeared. A mosaic of logos, nonprofits, PACs, law firms, media partners, all traced back through financial and political ties to Letitia James and her circle. It looked less like a network of justice and more like a criminal syndicate pretending to be a movement. This isn't justice. This is influence laundering. This is the modern democratic machine where every scandal is rebranded as equity, every whistleblower is painted as a racist, and every crime becomes a policy debate. Pam leaned in, voice like a scalpel. And if this chamber has any integrity left, we won't just stop with Letitia. We will follow every dollar, every shell company, every staffer who signed their name to this con. Because if we don't, if we let her fall and call it a day, then we're not fighting corruption, we're managing it. The silence that followed wasn't passive, it was thunderous. Because everyone in that room, from the most hardened partisan to the most naive idealist, knew she was right. Letitia James had not acted in the shadows. She acted under spotlights, applauded, enabled, protected. She became powerful because no one dared stop her, and she believed, like so many on the left, that ideology would be her immunity. She was wrong. Pam continued, her words now a final indictment, not just against a woman, but against a movement. This party, this machine, it talks about saving democracy while destroying dissent. It talks about transparency while redacting every truth. It weaponizes identity, exploits tragedy, and buries the people it claims to serve beneath a mountain of false virtue. They called her brave. They called her bold. But Letitia James wasn't brave. She was just untouchable, until today. Across the room, Democratic aides whispered frantically. Their queen had fallen, and they were scrambling to rewrite the ending. But there was no alternate version now. There was only the wreckage, the receipts, the record. The headlines were already writing themselves. Attorney General under federal investigation for fraud, obstruction. Pam Bondi unveils political laundering scheme in NY Justice Office. Letitia James' legal legacy crumbles under congressional fire. And underneath them, the real story. the one the people would never forget. That power, unchecked, does not liberate. It corrupts. Pam Bondi stood tall, a silhouette of defiance against a backdrop of institutional rot. She didn't grandstand. She didn't gloat. She simply ended with a warning. Letitia James may be the first. She won't be the last, because this isn't about one corrupt official. It's about a system that manufactures them, launders them, and then protects them until someone dares to speak louder than the narrative. So here's the question we leave this room with. Not just for this committee, not just for this Congress, but for every American who's been lied to by the people they were told to trust. She paused, looked directly into the cameras now, beyond the walls to the country itself. How many more Letitias are out there? And when will we stop waiting for them to fall and start making them answer? The gavel dropped. The hearing ended. But the storm was just beginning.